Hello, everyone. Welcome to another post debate analysis for Debatable Open 2024. With me today is our motion contributor for the feminism and gender motion set, Lia Snyder. Hi, Leah. How are you?
Hi, great to be here. I'm doing great. I hope you're doing great too.
So, we have a great set of motions for this theme. So, we're going to talk about each one of them in sequence. The first one is about whether or not the feminist movement should support transmaxing. Now, transmaxing, before you made this motion, was something that I wasn't really familiar with. And there was quite a lengthy info slide. But in lieu of the info slide, Leah, could you tell us a bit more about what transmaxing is?
Right. So transmaxing is basically like a practice that's done by certain people who were previously part of the involuntary celibate community or incels, as you might have heard. And a lot of these people who choose to transmax believe that it's the only way that they can really stop being an incel. And not just to stop being an incel and to leave that community, but to more importantly be able to take in certain benefits that they believe that women are disproportionately allowed to have. So this might be like, for example, women are the ones who get free meals or free dates from men. They can have certain benefits like diversity hiring. There's companies that employ or prefer to employ women because they're diversity hires, or there's certain policies that they can opt into because they're women, or even just like the ability to choose who their sexual partners are. There's a very common idea within the incel community that women are the ones who have the upper hand in terms of choosing their sexual partners because they have like a disposal of men at their fingertips, right? If they want a man, that's up to them. If they'll get to choose if they want a man or not. So to a lot of these people, those are the benefits that they want to be able to have. So in order to have those benefits, they choose to transmax.
Okay, so this is quite a unique motion, and I was wondering what inspired this.
Actually, I've been reading up a lot on incels lately, and it's really a spectrum, right? It's not just incels. They have men going their own way. There's also pickup artists, which I think you've probably seen a few of on TikTok or if you're in social media. Really, when I first started thinking about involuntary celibacy and its variations or the spectrum, I felt a very strong knee-jerk reflex because I'm a feminist, and of course, to me, what I know of people who are incels is that they're violent or they're and or misogynistic. But the more that I read up on it, because I read this book by Laura Bates, it's called Men Who Hate Women. So see, Laura Bates, what she did was she conducted this very in-depth investigation of what it's like to be part of that community. She took up a fake identity as a man so that she could really infiltrate these spaces and try to understand the kind of like why these people think this way, like their psychology, their motivating factors, etc. And really, at its core, inceldom is really just another social movement or community, much like how feminism is one. And I think it's really important to approach this topic with an open mind and, as much as possible, don't have preconceived judgment, which I know is going to be difficult. But because I think it's crucial to be able to, that you should be able to understand inceldom, or at least to some extent, incels, because it helps to inform and shape feminism as well, like how women's rights liberation comes into play because of other byproducts of the patriarchy. And really, at its core, inceldom is also a byproduct of patriarchy. These are men who grew up in spaces, or at least from coming from backgrounds where they've been taught a certain version of what it means to be a man, of gender roles, of how that balance is in society. And then when they go out into society, that's, right now it's like changing, it's evolving, there's feminism, there's progression and all that, right? So whatever's happening in society, their reality does not align with what they were taught. So that's why they feel that they have more solace, or at least more alignment with people within that community, because much like other people within the community, they have a very different experience from what was taught to them and what they're experiencing in reality. So yeah, that's it for why it was inspired.
Yeah, I think that I really resonate with the idea that you should be really open-minded because it's very easy to just judge a person for what they're doing. And I think even people who do bad things are still people, and
Yeah,
maybe to their mind, they're not, they're not evil. So
yeah.
it's always fascinating to me, looking at the psychology of the people whom many debaters consider to be bad or do evil
Hmm.
things.
Yeah.
So for this motion, what I wanted to ask is, in terms of arguments, how do you think both sides would go about the main question here, which is, since this is a motion about the feminist movement, what would be the interest of the feminist movement in accepting or not accepting transmaxing people?
Right. So I think yung crucial nuance here really is like knowing what is strategic for the feminist movement. That's why it's an actor motion. And that's also why I felt motivated na we had to take it from a perspective of the feminist movement. Because absent the actor in the motion, it might become really skewed to one side. But I think for government, for example, when you reject transmaxing or if you don't support transmaxing, right? It's for in a way you're rejecting the narrative that's coming from incel community that women have the upper hand in the first place, which is at its core precisely why a lot of people don't support women's liberation because they don't think that women need to be liberated if they're already having the upper hand in the first place, right? I think one part of it that's really going to be contentious, at least coming from government, is that when transmaxers choose to transmax, they can argue that, it's maybe it's not coming from the same type of motivation as other non-transmaxers. So in a way, they're using these resources and co-opting real experiences from people who are discriminated, people who have real struggles in exchange for some kind of perceived benefit. So I think here it's kind of like you can take it from a strong principled case potential because the fact that they come from incel community themselves, the fact that they are men, the fact that they have been socialized in largely or strongly misogynistic spaces, they are coming from the side of the oppressor. So not supporting practices like transmaxing is crucial in order to protect that pursuit of women's liberation because the comparative would be allowing these oppressors themselves into the movement, specifically into spaces that's supposed to be safe for one of the most disenfranchised subset of women, which are trans women. So even if their intentions might not be bad, or at least they're not actively malicious because they're just, I just want this benefit. I'm just trying to get that benefit. The byproduct of that, or at least the result of that, is that they're still allowing oppressors into something that should be sacred for trans women, especially because they are the ones who have these real experiences. And in a way, it's jeopardizing the ability of the feminist movement to kind of shape and create those safe spaces for the women that they're trying to protect. But I think comparatively for opposition, a good point to think about is how do we determine who is a transmaxer and not, right? It's difficult to determine because I would think that people who transmax have very little incentive to be very, very vocal that they are transmaxers because if they do say or declare that they're transmaxers, then they're probably not going to be able to get the benefits that they want as much as they want, or they're going to get actively ostracized by the very group that they're trying to get the benefits of. So they're more likely to keep it to themselves. And if they're not actively saying that they're transmaxers, when the feminist movement outright does not support those transmaxers, then it kind of creates like an Among Us type situation because trans people themselves don't know who's a transmaxer and who's not. And in a way that also jeopardizes the safe space in itself because they don't know who they can trust within the community. It might worsen those relations, even more so that it's coming from feminist movement as a message, then they have strong influence. They have ability to validate or legitimize a certain action. And so if they do that, it might not be fully strategic for the feminist movement themselves because it's going to probably alienate a certain subset of people that they want to support women's liberation in the first place, or those are the people that they're trying to protect within the pursuit of women's liberation. So I think that's the first clash that I can think of.
For opposition here, we're saying that it's very difficult to see who is a trans maxer and who's just another trans person. So
Mhm.
would it be fair for opposition to argue that the impact of rejecting trans maxers is we're looking at like really weird criteria for
Mhm.
who do we consider to be a trans maxer? And you mentioned it was a spectrum. And would you imagine that this might lead to some degree of transphobia at the end where you say, oh, you're probably just trying to be a woman because you think it's easier for us
Yeah.
when so can you imagine that this would be weaponized by TERFs to be against trans people in general?
I think that's a really good point, and I agree actually. So in terms of, because earlier we talked about how it could create rifts within the trans community themselves, but I do agree with you. I think it's going to be an opportunity for people who are already against trans people in the first place to kind of validate their points that like that's exactly what we're saying, that people can just if today I decide that I want to be a woman and that there's malicious intent assigned to that to further invalidate what it means to be trans in the first place. So I think on that regard, it can also be an opportunity, or at least rather not an opportunity, more of a risk for the community, and especially for the feminist movement, if they do outright like not support these things, then it's also validating TERFs, right? Because they don't recognize trans women to be part of feminist community in the first place. And now if the outside feminist movement, or the overall rather feminist movement themselves, is rejecting transmaxxers, then it further validates those sentiments coming from TERFs, I think.
Yeah, so in that sense, opposition is basically saying that you're making J.K. Rowling seem like she has a point.
Yeah.
So I think on that note, it might be strategic either way. Like you can argue for strategy either way.
Mhm.
But you mentioned earlier that you're inspired because of the psychology of these transmaxers. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how it might be used in the debate?
So I think if we're going to focus on the psychology of transmaxers, or at least people who are previously from the incel community, it might be a bit more strategic for opposition to take this frame. So a bit of context: a lot of transmaxers probably come from a place where they're desperate, or they're feeling very put down by society. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of people who end up in the incel community were raised in spaces where they were convinced that, men or males have a very specific role and responsibilities that come with that role in society, but society has evolved not in alignment with what they've been taught, right? And now women have the benefits. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, becoming an incel, or the incel community, if you really break it down at its core, they're also a byproduct of patriarchy themselves. In the same way that toxic masculinity is a byproduct of patriarchy that hurts men as well, I would think people who end up in transmaxing opportunities, or thinking about wanting to be a transmaxer, is also that, right? So at its core, for opposition, it's a chance to kind of see the movement, to recognize this as a leverage against the patriarchy, or to show that, men, you have more than just a toxic masculinity personal stake here, because they are actively people who feel that the only way that they can actually opt out of the patriarchy and inceldom is to become a woman themselves. Which then goes to say that, the feminist movement can leverage on that messaging, or to exploit that messaging to further show men that, the people that you think are on your side, or the people that you're trying to protect, right? Or at least amongst yourselves, are also people who are getting hurt. And at least now, because we are the ones who are supporting them, because we're accepting transmaxers, or at least we're not outright rejecting them, we're the ones who are providing them that safe space, which you guys were unable to do so because of the existing like practices that you have, or the existing ideals that you have within the patriarchy. But I think, right, it's also fair for the government to respond to this with saying it's really not the feminist movement's job or mandate to help men out of inceldom, or to help them navigate themselves out of like the destructive parts of patriarchy, right? Or even so, even if like we want to do that as feminists, or even if we recognize that men suffer as well from the patriarchy, and that's also a normal byproduct of being part of the patriarchy. For the feminist movement, there's more pressing concerns to prioritize, right? Like women actively being subjected to violence, women being disenfranchised, or women not being allowed to access rights that men do, right? So in terms of it, kind of also becomes like a resources concern, because if the feminist movement already has limited traction, has limited potential, that they are in a controversial space where any kind of move can be weaponized against them, then it makes more sense that we really just prioritize those needs of women that we know already actively are being hurt more than men who are just trying to get the benefit that they perceive women to have, which I think is already a common debate in feminism, right? Where do we need male allies to achieve women's liberation? Or is it a priority for us to get male allies to get women's liberation? Because if it is, then it makes more sense that we're going to co-opt, or to use transmaxing as an opportunity to show them that this is a problem you guys are also creating for yourselves. But comparatively, it's also kind of like, if we think feminism and the goals of feminism are better met if we don't prioritize male allies, then perhaps it's more preferable to exclusively work with women, to prioritize resources and opportunities with women themselves, as opposed to anyone else outside of the movement or the community.
So I think the last question I have for this motion is in terms of like extensions, are there any like really promising extensions that you can think of for either side here?
Right. I think for government, you can really extend on how, rather, you can see that a lot of people who transmax don't do it with a malicious intent. right? But even if that is the case, right, it's more about prioritizing the care or attention to people who are at greater risk, or more of the principle of how we want to make sure that the people we are protecting are people who are already within the community in the first place, instead of, trying to get more support from people who are outside of the community, coming from spaces that were previously very misogynistic, and you recognize that it's harder to convince someone who doesn't believe in your ideals of your community in the first place, or that they come from a space where they actively, rejected or actively opposed the goals of feminism as well, and instead directing that attentions and all of that to people who you believe deserve it more, because they are the ones who, at least it's easier to actually help them, right? And that their spaces or whatever circumstances they're in are more aligned with supporting feminism, and therefore achieving the goals of feminism, right? But I think for opposition, you can also take it as an opportunity to talk about how the feminist movement can create a welcoming space for people who choose to transmax. And like I mentioned earlier, transmaxers, or as with any other like identity or experience, right? It's probably coming from a spectrum. There's probably a very complex journey within that pipeline. And there could be people who transmax and later on realize that they really are actually queer. Because if you consider the pipeline coming from you're in a strong, traditionally masculine background, and then you get socialized or you end up in an incel community, and then you find yourself strongly wanting to leave that community, and you think the only option to do that is transmaxing, to the point that some of them actually really go through hormone replacement therapy. They go to like psychologists to talk about gender dysphoria. Obviously, the degree of genuinity is not something that we can ascertain, but that in itself might signal that there are people who, it's a convoluted way, but that's how they figure out that they have a certain gender identity as well. And for the feminist movement, is that something that we want to dictate or police? Is that something that we want to support? Or is that something that we don't think is a significant importance yet, at least in comparison to other goals or other more pressing concerns that the feminist movement has? So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think that was a great discussion, and it's really interesting that, you know, something that you might consider to be very one-sided or very black and white, like they're just doing this to, to deprive other people, or to
Yeah.
they're doing this because they want to put down the experiences of women, like the hardships that they face, right? But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, they might also be going through something that deserves a level of support, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
perhaps there can be a discussion about whether, like, the feminist movement in general can be, a place for everyone, like everyone who might feel
Yeah.
vulnerable, and it might not matter why you decide to transition. The fact that you are transitioning means that you deserve some level of support or some level of protection. And that's a very interesting conversation that this motion might bring up. But
Mm-hmm.
moving on to the next motion, the second motion is about a feminist woman who is offered a CEO position. So the info slide talks about who the actor is. So the actor for the second motion is a 30-year-old Filipino feminist woman working at a reputable multinational company. And what happened was the CEO of that company was male, but got into a series of scandals. And so the company or the board offered the actor, the feminist woman, as the CEO position to hopefully restore the company to its former success. So the motion reads, this house, as the feminist woman, would accept the CEO position. You mentioned in the info slide that this person is a girl boss, right? So
Mm-hmm.
aside from like this whole thing about girl bossing and whatnot, is there any particular like concept that you want debaters to know about, or you want debaters to sort of explore in this type of debate?
Right. Actually, Kyle, have you heard of the term glass cliff?
I actually have not.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm super curious as to what that is.
Okay, so glass cliff is actually a phenomenon where women are more likely to occupy positions of leadership that are risky and precarious. And this is something that can happen where there's like share price performance is poor, or if the company is facing a scandal, or if the role involves some sort of reputational risk. So it's a phenomenon in leadership or in organizations, and it roots from assumptions and biases that women are more capable of handling people, navigating emotions, etc. So more often than not, they are the ones who are seen as having the most potential to handle, like, those scandals, the risks, etc., and to bring the company back to success. And actually, it doesn't always come from a malicious space. More often than not, it can be done in egalitarian or progressive institutions that believe women are capable. So this phenomenon, this glass cliff phenomenon, I initially thought about adding it in the motion or in the info slide, but I actively chose not to because it might sound like a doomed end for the woman and therefore skew the debate. But really, at its core, it's a phenomenon that happens, but it doesn't mean that women have not yet been successful in navigating a similar situation as the actor in the motion. So yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. Because another thing I was thinking about when you mentioned like women are more likely to occupy positions of leadership when things are not going that well, I
Mhm.
was imagining also like if you are a woman and and this is a fact, like in many places, in many workplaces, there are just not a lot of opportunities that are available for career advancement. If
Yeah.
you are offered like a position, even though it's very risky, you're more likely to accept it because you have fewer alternatives. Would that be
Yeah.
accurate to say?
I think so, yeah. And I do think that's also kind of a motivating factor for a lot of women to take up leadership positions, even if they themselves know that it's a risky one. Because at least it's better than not doing it and then not being provided a similar opportunity ever again.
Yeah, so in terms of like because the info slide also mentioned that they're a girl boss. Is there something that you can like is this a point of comparison between like Glass Cliff and being a girl boss? Is this a point of contention that you imagine might come up in the debate?
Right. Actually, yeah, it was part of what inspired the motion as well. I wanted to contrast the glass cliff phenomenon with girl boss feminism. Because as you know, girl boss feminism is like, you feel like you can do everything, you're breaking glass ceilings. And more often than not, girl boss feminism is kind of the predominant messaging that we see nowadays, especially amongst younger people, right? Amongst our generation and maybe the generations just before us and right after us. So I think it's kind of like what's shaping a lot of women's feminism as well. Thinking about how, the world is my oyster and any kind of structural barriers are really just, they're barriers, yes, but I still think that I can overcome them. So the reason why I wanted to contrast that with glass cliff phenomenon is because the question of a debate would really be like, are these things that are within our controls? Are these things that are just, as a lot of girl boss feminists believe, just opportunities waiting for us to break into? Or are there like really just things that we have to concede to, that there are barriers or there are limitations to how much girl bossing we can do? That girl bossing is not an end all be all solution. And at the end of the day, no matter how much we want something, like systemic or structural barriers are going to hinder it anyway. But that's particularly why I didn't want to put glass cliff as a term within the info slide or the motion, because I don't want people to immediately assume that it's just a systemic thing or that it's just a structural thing. I wanted it to be a question of, if you as the actor were in this position, how would you perceive it to be? Would you think that it's something that's still within your reach? Or would you think it's more strategic or reasonable to assume that, that this is way too big of an ask for me and I don't think that's for me to do?
Yeah, I think getting into like the arguments that both sides can talk about here, it seems like for Gov, you can argue that, there's a huge opportunity for the actor, for the feminist woman. On the other hand, like in opposition, you can just like play out the risk. Like this is a huge risk
Mhm.
that there's a big possibility that you might fail. So I think my question now is how do you compare like the best and the worst cases for both sides? Like how would you go about doing that on either side actually in this debate?
Right. I think for government, firstly, we can talk about how, like as you said, it's an opportunity, right? It's not just an opportunity for the actor themselves, it's also an opportunity for other women, right? So the fact that they're feminists, they're girl boss, they've been breaking gender barriers for their entire career. Taking up the position will open up doors to be able to give those kind of opportunities to other women, right? Especially she's a woman of color, she's a Filipino. So she might recognize that, the opportunities that I can give to women who are like me and other minorities is going to be at least, a comparatively better benefit than any kind of risk that I might think of. Because even if she does fail in the position, right? Even if success is not guaranteed, those things like walking so that other people can run are still things that she can do regardless, as long as she's in that CEO position, because she's going to have that power to be able to do bigger things. I think, like if she's able to salvage the company, obviously it's going to be significantly better for them. But I think just being in the position alone would mean that it's easier for her to lobby for things like gender pay equity, diversity and equity or inclusion initiatives, or, at least trying to change the larger systems and structures within the company. And since they are a reputable multinational company, those kinds of decisions or initiatives can create waves that will eventually influence other companies and organizations as well. So at least in her position, it could be like I could really just mess up and this could be really horrible for me, but at least I'm doing something really great for the community and for women that are going to come after me. But I think for opposition, as you said, you can really talk about the risk, right? It's essentially setting herself up for failure if they really want to frame it that way, because the failure is going to be comparatively worse, right? The fact that she's a woman and she's taking up a position that was previously given to a male is something that's going to be very visible, right? The fact that she's put into that position precisely with the hopes that she can fix the previous CEO's mess means that there's higher expectations for her, especially since she's coming from a place where she's been breaking these barriers, she's competent, right? She's a girl boss. So people have this certain image of her. So then the question there is then, why is it her responsibility to fix the organization just because she's good? Why is it her responsibility to do all of these things that are at the, at the cost of herself, at the cost of her own goals and opportunities, her own reputation, her own career, just so that she can maybe get some certain benefits for other people, or that she could maybe salvage the company? I think it's also a good thing to bring in if you're talking about the risk. Like, what's the personal goals and wants of this woman? Like, she's 30. Maybe she wants family. Maybe she doesn't want to stay in the career anymore further. No matter what those individual goals or motivations might be, those are things that she has to trade off by taking up this position, right? Because she knows that the moment she takes up this position, she's got to hit the ground running. It's really about fixing the organization, which means to say all of the things that I talked about earlier, the benefits, the pay equity initiatives that she could do for other women, are not guaranteed either, right? Like the first thing that she has to do first is to fix the company so that she could actually be able to lobby for those things, right? Because absent fixing the company, or if she's unable to fix the company, while she can still lobby for all of those things for other women and minorities, she might not be seen as a reliable actor as much as she would be if she was actually successful, or people are going to attach her actions or her failures to her character, which would then make it even more difficult for her to do her job well, which by the way is a common phenomenon as well with women leadership, that a lot of women experience other people, their subordinates, their colleagues or higher ups, attaching their decisions that are made within an organization or within a position to them, their personal character as women or as individuals. And that happens regardless if it's a good or bad decision. But you would argue that probably if it's a bad decision or something that, hurts other people in the long run, is going to be more visible or memorable, right? So at least on that end, even if there's an opportunity and there's an equal risk, it really depends on how each side is going to frame it, as to what extent is the benefit or harms from taking either opportunity or risk.
Now, I wanted to go back to this concept of like girl bossing and, like knowing your limits, so to speak, and
Mhm.
like whether that should be the end all be all of your life as, a person of that age. Because I can imagine like the emotional or psychological toll on this actor might be quite significant. Like just the pressure that they might be
Yeah.
facing, like to salvage an entire multinational company, no less, right? So can you tell me a bit more about the effects that it would have on this particular actor or this kind of actor, right? If ever the worst comes to happen and she does end up failing, like how do you imagine like teams can paint the impacts of, what might end up happening?
Right. I think, I know, for opposition, they can definitely paint it as failure would be a severe fall from a pedestal, which would be ego breaking, right? It's going to destroy her, because not just emotionally and mentally, because she's thinking about, I have this whole company who's waiting for me to fix it. I have so many employees who are waiting for me to help them and everything, and I couldn't, right? And especially when you put it into the context of how she's always been a girl boss, she's always been breaking gendered barriers. So it's probably that she, even if she's experienced that struggle, she's not yet experienced this level of failure. Which means even if she's already somewhat good at navigating some level of failure, it's still going to be reasonably very difficult for her to navigate this. Which, once it starts eroding her emotional strength, her resilience, it starts taking a toll on her mental health. I think already at a point wherein she's having a hard time believing in herself, where she knows the odds are stacked up against her and all that, then it's going to be a lot more difficult for her to actually pursue things that would help her become successful in the long run. Which means to say that it'll be harder for her to make strategic decisions. It'll be harder for her to do simple things like, like to show up at work because it could be as difficult as getting up in the morning because you know how much pressure is on you. So it seems like there's a level of inertia. I just don't want to do it anymore, right? Which are all reasonable things to happen and experience with someone in her position, right? And I think the critical nuance there, or at least interesting nuance to put, is these are experiences that she's going to have, even if she takes up the CEO position with full like grit and resilience and belief in herself. Like even if she starts from a place where there's no doubts, right? Or if even if she starts from a place where she's reasonable and rational about it, right? Like that she's thinking about how I could fail, but I'm okay with that. It's also normal that somewhere along the way, it breaks her to a point that she realizes that she couldn't do it, right? Or that she realizes that, you know, I wish I hadn't done it. I kind of regret it. But also because in terms of opportunities, if she does fail, the company is going to lose trust in her. Her employees, her subordinates, the board of directors, right? Whoever put her in that position in the first place, they're also understandably going to lose trust in her. Obviously, worst case is that they hate her, they think she's a horrible person, right? But I think what's more realistic is probably that they're going to be disappointed, right? They might lose some level of trust. But even if it's just that small marginal change in trust, it's also going to be extremely damaging for her because she's built up this identity, this reputation of someone who's so capable, and then suddenly she couldn't handle this. And that could also impact the kind of opportunity she gets after she leaves the CEO position or whatever decisions she might make afterwards. But I think for government, the way that you can frame this is that failure is going to be bad, but it's not going to be new to her. And even if the degree of failure is not going to be as easy or at least as manageable as it was before, the fact that she has consistently persisted in breaking gender barriers means that she already has a degree of experience of those discriminations, and yet she still proved to be competent, which speaks to her personality, which speaks to her character, etc. But even if like the worst case scenario happens, which is that you start thinking you can do it, it's great, and then you fail halfway and then it's just downhill. I think government can also talk about how the fact that she has a good reputation means that she's probably likely to be able to get social support, right? And that kind of social support is crucial because she can still work on fixing the company with her team, right? She's not working alone. She's a CEO. She probably has other people within the company. It's a multinational company that's reputable, which means very likely they have a strong organization. It's just that they had a really shitty CEO, right? That they removed precisely because they couldn't do their job. So I think another way that government can really see it as is that it doesn't have to be a question of how bad the failure is going to be, but more of thinking about what support systems are probably already in place that will mitigate the impact of that failure. And also, in contrast to, as I said earlier, it's really walking so that other people could run. That's probably something that keeps her also wanting to pursue the position as well, regardless of the framing coming from opposition.
So with that last point, like you're walking so that other people can learn how to run, I think that's also a little bit debatable, right? Because
Mhm.
for Gov, I can imagine like you can sort of argue that yeah, like you're representing the movement, you're going to
Mhm.
create like great strides for women everywhere. But also I remember like one of my professors who is a feminist, she's a woman, she's been in the industry for a very long time,
Mhm.
but she's very, very hard on women because she said like verbatim she hates stupid women because it's much easier for men to be stupid in whatever
Yeah.
industry, right? So I can imagine like it was very hard for my female classmates because they needed to be at 110% all the time. So can you
Mhm.
tell me a little bit more about like what are the impacts of this representation aspect of taking on this role?
I think for government, it's pretty straightforward. We've discussed it already, right? It's walking so that other people can run. But I think for opposition, you can talk about how that kind of representation to some extent can be tokenistic. And that, much like your prof, just because there's a woman up there doesn't mean that she represents me. And I think that's kind of a sentiment that I share with some feminist icons as well. Like there are feminist icons who I don't completely agree with, or at least they're women and then they try to co-opt the feminist identity, but you can tell that they're not really fighting for women's liberation. I'm not gonna name names because that might be controversial. But my point is that, sometimes it's tokenistic. Sometimes the reason why they're up there is really just because they're women. And much like the earlier motion we talked about, there's certain benefits that come with being a minority because society is trying to equalize the experience for minorities as well. But I think with that, how to navigate that is really just to break it down from an actor standpoint. how you would frame that actor, even if it's viewed as tokenistic, does that impact the way that she's able to actually represent or advocate for other women? Especially if she already identifies as a feminist in the first place. Or even if the worst case is that, other people within the community or the organization or larger industry do think it's a tokenistic appointment, then perhaps that could be a driving force for the actor, right? She's a girl boss. She probably will see it as a, if you're gonna spite me, then out of spite, I'm going to prove you wrong, which I think is also a common mentality coming from girl bosses, right? Or at least I would think so. And so it could really also just be it's not something that will hinder me or stop me, but more of something that motivates me so that I can really meet the goal of representation, even if it might be tokenistic. And even if it might be tokenistic, at least we're getting it, right? Like the comparative is that we put another CEO who's a man, and then, or like we mentioned earlier at the start of this motion, that sometimes women don't get accorded those opportunities at all, or they're passed up those opportunities. So the fact that a woman is being given this opportunity could really be seen as a strength instead. But again, it really depends on how each side debates it.
Yeah, I think so. That was a really interesting discussion again, and I think it's very relatable for many people who work under a quote unquote girl boss or girl bosses themselves. So it was a very good topic to have in our tournament. But I want to move on to the last motion in the set, which is about like how should we treat as a feminist movement, how should they treat men? Like, should we focus on bad aspects of masculinity, like toxic masculinity, or like healthier versions of masculinity? The motion reads, this house prefers a world where feminists focus on healthy masculinity narratives like validating male emotion, vulnerability, etc., as opposed to toxic masculinity. Can you tell me a bit more about, the inspiration behind this motion?
Right. So actually, I was discussing with my partner. We're talking about how toxic masculinity is probably the biggest buy-in for a lot of men who are not feminists or who don't believe in feminism, in order for them to understand feminism is for them too. And that's also the messaging that a lot of feminists use, right? That, the patriarchy hurts you too because they don't let you cry, even if you should be able to cry, right? That's perfectly valid. Or they don't allow you to be vulnerable because of whatever expectations the patriarchy has, right? But I think the concept of toxic masculinity in feminist discourse is also the reason why many people don't actively agree with feminism, because for a lot of people, they interpret it as you're seeing men, or you're seeing feminism rather, as a man hater club, because you're telling men like these are all of the things that are wrong with you. These are all of the things where toxic masculinity is bad, right? That at its core, toxic masculinity tells you what kind of characteristics within men or within masculinity is bad. So the question is then, what if the messaging has historically been a focus on how men should be, what is healthy, instead of focusing on how they should not be, right? So how could that have shaped the world that we live in if feminist discourse and overall buy-in into the movement wasn't based on pointing out the wrongs of men, but focusing on what they can do better?
So for Gov here, how do you imagine teams to mechanize this argument that like the way that feminist discourse and buy into the movement would have improved if this were the case, right? Like, how do you imagine government teams to sell this? How do you imagine it to mechanize it and build it as an argument?
Right. I think for the most part, it's more of a kinder type of message. It definitely paints feminism and feminists as, I would think, less angry, which I think is a common conception a lot of non-feminists have. Like feminists or women are always so angry, etc., because of whatever reason, which I'll talk about later on. But I think from government, they might mechanize this as like, healthy masculinity or messages of healthy masculinity would probably be more palatable or acceptable to men, because instead of pointing out their wrongs, you're telling them like, this is a point of improvement, or this is what you want to see. So they're more likely to feel less defensive, as opposed to toxic masculinity that kind of alienates men from the movement further, because they might perceive it as you're creating negative stereotypes about us, you're interpreting our good behavior or our well-intentioned behavior as bad. And so at least on government side, they might think, men are less likely to attack feminism. And I think a good example of this is how, how chivalry and certain behavior from men is, from their side, they mean it well, but it can be perceived as toxic masculinity by women or by people who don't agree with those behaviors. So I think one would be like, men are trying to pick up women, or they're trying to woo someone, like ligaw and everything. And it's coming from a place of like, I want to pamper her, I want to take care of her. But because of the way that it's done and other like conflicting dynamics in society or for whatever reason, it's perceived as like, it's creepy, that's not it, we don't want it, we think that's kind of toxic masculinity because you're expecting women to accept you just because you're doing this good thing for us, right? So those kinds of conflicts or dynamics in society can really create kind of aggression within the two parties, right? So at least coming from a healthy masculinity standpoint, government might argue that it's less likely for men to have that same level of aggression as they do in status quo, because at least they don't actively attacked, they don't feel that you're singling them out for doing something that might have been well intended in the first place. But even more so, people who don't actually care, like people who are indifferent, are at least more likely to disengage from feminism or feminist discourse instead of attack, because at least they're not emotionally charged as it be with toxic masculinity, which in some cases might be perceived as antagonizing men, right? And if you perceive it as that way, then women are more likely to be harmed because men are going to retaliate. But I think most importantly, it might help a focus on healthy masculinity is a lot more actionable for men who really do want to change, right? Because when you tell them that this is bad, doesn't necessarily tell them immediately what is good. At least if you focus on healthy masculinity, like this is what we think it means to be like a good man, or what we would expect from a healthy masculine man, then behavior change is a lot more likely because there's clear steps, there's models, or at least there's a framework that they can follow so that they know what it means to be a healthy masculine man. But I think for opposition, right, there's a few reasons why we should have stayed with status quo. And that firstly is that toxic masculinity being controversial and emotion provoking is good because it means more people will pay attention, more people will discuss. That's traction for the feminist movement that inspires people to actually check their behavior, right? Because they feel like, oh, I think I identify with this. I think this is something that I've been doing. And I don't mean it, but at least I know it's bad, right? So at least defensiveness can still happen on both sides. At least you have more people truly assessing if they're being toxic, if they have incentive to do so because emotion is provoked. Because comparatively in healthy masculinity, I would think it's more neutral, like it's not going to attack people as much as toxic masculinity would, or at least that's how they would perceive it as attacking, right? So it's not going to get as much traction. It's not going to be as controversial. Like there's still going to be people who disagree or not support, but it's not going to be at the level that toxic masculinity is being discussed. So I guess in those terms, like if it's not really something people pay a lot of attention to, or if it's not provoking that much emotion, then it might not shift or tip into behavior change, right? So even if they might know what it means to be healthy, it might not mean that they will try to be healthy because they don't see anything bad with what they're doing in the first place. But I think also, as I mentioned earlier, right, talked about how healthy masculinities is more of a kinder type of messaging because in status quo, feminists are perceived as angry. I think on opposition, you can really say like, yeah, we should be angry. We are oppressed. We are victimized by patriarchy. We are angry, and we are going to use that anger to like motivate us to tell men that they're wrong, so that they can actually check themselves. Because comparatively, if you focus on healthy masculinity, you can really see it as you can frame it as a soft feminist stance. Like you're kind of coddling men because you don't want to tell them that they're wrong. Like you're kind of buying into the narrative, like, like boys will be boys, so we don't tell them off, right? So opposition can really paint that as like it's going to be more destructive to us if we're not going to oppose that kind of behavior more strongly. But more importantly, it can also come from a place of thinking, as feminists, it's not our duty to tell them how to be good men, right? They should be able to figure it out themselves. They are men. They literally are in the patriarchal stance of society, which means they have more power than us. They should be able to figure that out themselves. But even more so, that kind of messaging is more likely to hold them accountable because it's going to foster greater awareness of how gender norms shape their own personal experiences and other structures in society, which can be the tipping point to challenge their own attitudes and, later on promote better types of masculinity.
I think it's very interesting, and this has been a running theme across the different motions that you've talked about today, which is people tend to be complex. So
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine like a lot of men, even when they have a lot of aspects of toxic masculinity in them, they might have some few aspects of healthier types of masculinity. So when I was growing up, I did have a lot of toxic masculinity, but so for example, I tended to look down on women, or like I was really almost borderline incel type. Like
Mhm,
I was really upset. I felt really really lonely that women weren't liking me. But at the same
mhm,
time, like I was very open about my emotions. I never like faulted anybody for being emotional. So
mhm,
in this particular emotion, can you imagine like if you're on Gov, can you argue that if we nurture, or yeah, I guess it is kind of nurturing. If we
mhm.
encourage like those aspects of men, like it's already there, they already have it. They might not have the entire set, but they might have one particular item in that list. Can you imagine a world where, they look at that list and they identify an item and they say, oh, that's just like me. And that might encourage them to embody more items on that list.
I think that's a really good point, actually. I think the way you just framed it is great because it really shows how in reality people are not black and white, right? And I think it's great if we do frame it that way because at least it makes the individual feel that success is more achievable to them, right? Because I already have certain traits on the list that I have. What's just going to be the next actionable step is probably to try and incorporate all the other healthy masculine traits into the list. And I think coming from government, that's also very strategic because it makes it, it creates a more positive environment for men to be able to more readily opt into feminism because they see it as a, like it's an us thing. And I'm more likely to be able to see that my goals or my wants and needs still align to some degree with feminism. So I'm more likely to participate into that. But I think for opposition, right, you could also probably argue that while it might create more like friction because they're going to think, oh, I do this and this and this, and feminism and feminists are telling me that I'm doing these wrong things. It can still be a tipping point for them to kind of question like, how can I be better? Even if it might send them down a path of, questioning to what degree they're able to do that at first. But I think the question there would be the pipeline to changing behavior. Is it something that's more actionable or more achievable in government when it's a more positive messaging? Or is it where you're really pointing out flaws, where they're more likely to actually pay attention to the wrong things that they're doing and be more active in terms of trying to change it because they don't want to be wrong as a result of knowing what the toxic masculinity is?
Yeah, I think that for opposition, right? Like there's also a list of bad things, right? There's a list of items, and perhaps a lot of men will be like, "Oh, that's me. You're saying that I'm a bad person," and stuff like that. But I can also imagine, like, even for the most cynical type of man, the
Mhm.
most cynical type of toxic man, where they like they don't agree that they're a bad person, even if they exhibit a lot of the red flags of toxic masculinity. I'm not sure if this would be a good argument, but I just thought of it like even for those people who just don't disagree with the list, it is possible for them to still want to be liked by women. So
Mhm.
perhaps even if they don't believe in it at first, there's still incentive for them to change their behavior, even if, at first it is just because they want to be liked by women, and
Mhm.
then by giving them that incentive of like I should probably change my behavior so I'm more likable to women, they'll end up actually embodying and believing in those types of healthier like masculinity narratives for themselves, and they get to realize it for themselves, not because they think, not because it was handed over to them, but because in the pursuit of wanting to be liked, they ended up getting to that realization of what a healthier, less toxic version of themselves they can be. Would that be a good argument for up? Or is it too weird to argue that, you know, it's fine because even though it's fine, even if you're just doing this so that you could get laid more, is that still a well argument for up?
I think it is because you can really argue that, at least when they go through that realization pipeline themselves, then the behavior change is probably more likely to be genuine and long lasting, right? Because it's tied to some personal epiphany that they had, right? Or some sort of whatever process they went through. As opposed to if in government, then it might feel like, you're giving them already the ways that you want them to change. And for a lot of them, they might change it on the surface level because they already know what that change might be. It might also, you can also argue in government that it might not really be genuine because much like men in op who just want to do it so that they can get laid, men in gov can also do the same things so that they could get some sort of benefit from women. At least I think the difference there is that when you start from a place where you point out why they're wrong, they have to go through the process of changing their own mindsets and understanding better why it's wrong on their own. as opposed to when you just tell them what's good.
Yeah, because at least then it would be like, what's the principle behind why this is bad?
Yeah.
So that I could pattern all other parts of the behavior, even those that are not necessarily included in that list, to match those principles. Well, it
Yeah.
was wonderful talking about these motions, and I really want to thank you again for agreeing to be our motion contributor for this set. Is there
Thank
anything
you
that you
so
want to end
much.
on before we end the post-debate analysis?
Well, first, I want to say thank you because I think this is a really cool opportunity and I rarely get to ramble to people about very feminist things. So I feel really glad to be able to have this platform. But I think most of all, last thing I would add is that anyone listening to this or anyone debating these topics or curious to learn more about these topics, like we said earlier, really approach it with an open mind. I think, especially as debaters, because we're strongly informed, we are opinionated people, we tend to create ideas and biases that we have very little incentive to check. It's only really when we approach topics like these with an open mind and trying to see it from both sides, not on a surface level, but really coming from a place of seeing that not everyone is black and white, as you said, that we can really understand further how people act in society and how that influences our ideals or opinions. So that's it.
Yeah, so there you have it. Thank you so much for listening to our post-debate analysis. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.